The sun was bleeding crimson across the Kansas sky when Silas Holt first heard the sound that would change everything, the desperate patter of bare feet on hard-packed earth. From his weathered porch, he watched a small figure stumble through the sagebrush, moving with the frantic urgency of prey fleeing predators. Silas set down his coffee, the tin cup clattering against the wooden rail. At 43, he'd learned to read trouble from a mile away, and this boy, no more than 11 years old, carried it like a storm cloud. Mister, please!" The child's voice cracked as he collapsed at the base of Silas's porch steps. Dust caked his tear-streaked face, and his clothes hung in tatters. They said they're gonna take your ranch tonight." Silas descended the steps slowly, his spurs chiming softly in the evening air. "Easy there, son." "Who said what now?" The boy's eyes, wide and green as spring grass, darted toward the horizon. "The men with the black horses. They killed my pa and took my sister. Said they're coming for you next, soon as the moon's high." A chill ran down Silas's spine despite the warm evening. He'd been expecting trouble, but not like this. Not involving children. "What's your name, boy?" "Billy. Billy Carter." The child wiped his nose with a grimy sleeve. "My pa was Thomas Carter. He had a claim about 10 miles south of here near Willow Creek." Silas knew the name. Thomas Carter had been one of the few honest homesteaders in these parts, trying to scratch out a living on land that bigger men wanted for themselves. "And your sister?" "Molly. She's 17. Billy's voice dropped to a whisper. "They took her when they burned our house. Said she'd fetch a good price in Dodge City." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd seen enough evil in his 43 years to know what that meant. His jaw tightened as he knelt beside the trembling boy. "Billy, I need you to tell me exactly what these men looked like. Every detail you can remember." The boy's breathing steadied slightly at Silas's calm tone. "There were 5 of them. The leader, he had a scar running from his left eye to his mouth, wore a black coat with silver buttons, called himself Garrett." Silas's blood turned to ice. Jake Garrett, a name he'd hoped never to hear again. A ghost from a past he'd tried desperately to bury. "The others," Billy continued. "One was real tall and thin like a scarecrow, another had gold teeth that glinted when he smiled. They all had the same mark burned into their saddles, a circle with a line through it, the Blackthorn brand." Silas's hands clenched into fists. Jedediah Blackthorn, the most powerful rancher in 3 counties, had finally made his move. "Billy, listen to me carefully," Silas said, helping the boy to his feet. "Those men won't be coming tonight. They want me to run, to abandon my land. But I've got news for them. I'm not going anywhere." "But they said a lot of things to scare you, son. That's what men like that do." Silas guided Billy toward the house. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up and fed. Then we're going to figure out how to get your sister back." Inside the modest ranch house, Silas watched Billy devour a plate of beans and cornbread like he hadn't eaten in days. The boy's hands shook as he ate, and his eyes kept darting to the windows. "How long since they took Molly?" Silas asked, pouring himself a whiskey. 3 days, maybe 4. Time's all mixed up." Billy set down his spoon. "Mr. Holt, why do they want your ranch? It ain't the biggest spread around." Silas stared into his glass, seeing reflections of old sins. "Sometimes it's not about what a place is, Billy. Sometimes it's about what it represents." "I don't understand." 10 years ago, there was a fire in Dodge City, burned down half the town, including the courthouse. A lot of records were lost that night. Deeds, claims, birth certificates. Some folks say it wasn't an accident. Billy's eyes widened. "You think Mr. Blackthorn started the fire?" "I think Jedediah Blackthorn is a man who gets what he wants, one way or another. And right now he wants every piece of land between here and the railroad." A distant sound made them both freeze, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Silas moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 5 riders were approaching in the moonlight, their black horses moving like shadows across the prairie. "They came anyway," Billy whispered, terror creeping back into his voice. Silas checked his Colt .45, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded. "Billy, there's a root cellar behind the kitchen. I want you to hide there and don't come out until I call for you. What about Molly? I promise you, son, we're going to find your sister. But first, I need to have a conversation with these gentlemen. As Billy disappeared into the cellar, Silas stepped onto his porch. The riders had stopped about 50 yards away, just beyond the reach of his lamplight. Their leader, a man with a distinctive scar, urged his horse forward. "Silas Holt!" Jake Garrett called out, his voice carrying across the night air. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough, Jake." Silas's hand rested casually on his gun butt. "I hear you've taken to kidnapping children these days. That's low, even for you." Garrett laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "The girl's safe, for now, but her future depends entirely on your cooperation. What does Blackthorn want?" "You know what he wants. The same thing he's always wanted. Your land. Specifically, that little deed you've got locked away. The one that proves this ranch has been in your family since before Kansas was even a state." Silas felt his heart skip. How could Garrett know about the deed? He'd hidden it so carefully, told no one. "I see that look in your eyes, Silas. Wondering how we found out?" Garrett's scarred face twisted into a grin. "Let's just say you're not the only one with secrets in this town. Sheriff Marks has been very helpful." The betrayal hit Silas like a physical blow. Virgil Marks had been his friend for over a decade. They'd served together in the war, watched each other's backs through countless dangers. "You're lying." "Am I? Who do you think told us about the boy? Who do you think suggested we use him to flush you out?" Garrett leaned forward in his saddle. "Face it, Silas, you're all alone out here. No friends, no allies, just like always." But Garrett was wrong. Silas wasn't alone anymore. Somewhere in his root cellar, a frightened boy was counting on him. And somewhere in Dodge City, a young woman needed rescuing. "Here's my counteroffer, Jake," Silas called out, his voice steady as stone. "You release the girl, and I won't kill all 5 of you where you sit." The outlaws laughed, but there was nervous energy in the sound. They remembered Silas Holt from the old days, remembered what he was capable of when cornered. "You've got until sunrise to think it over," Garrett said, wheeling his horse around. "After that, the girl starts paying for your stubbornness. And trust me, Silas, you don't want that on your conscience." As the riders disappeared into the darkness, Silas remained on his porch, mind racing. He'd underestimated Blackthorn's reach, underestimated how far the corruption had spread. But he'd made a promise to Billy, and Silas Holt had never broken a promise to a child. He called Billy up from the cellar and found the boy's face pale but determined. "What happens now?" Billy asked. Silas holstered his gun and reached for his hat. "Now we go to town. It's time I had a talk with Sheriff Marks." "But what if it's a trap?" Silas looked down at the boy, this brave, frightened child who'd risked everything to warn a stranger. "Billy, sometimes the only way out of a trap is to spring it yourself." As they prepared to ride into the night, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above, a figure who'd been listening to every word, and who now spurred his horse toward Dodge City with news that would change everything. The game was afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. The streets of Dodge City lay shrouded in an uneasy quiet as Silas and Billy rode into town under the cover of darkness. Gas lamps flickered like dying fireflies along Front Street, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of hidden dangers. The Long Branch Saloon spilled yellow light and raucous laughter into the night, but even that familiar sound carried an edge of desperation. Silas guided his horse toward the sheriff's office, Billy clinging tight behind him on the saddle. The boy hadn't spoken during their ride, but Silas could feel the tension radiating from his small frame. "Remember what I told you," Silas murmured as they dismounted. "Stay close, keep your eyes open, and if I tell you to run, you run." The sheriff's office sat dark and empty, its windows black as coal. Silas tried the door and found it locked, unusual for Virgil, who typically kept the office open all night. "Where is he?" Billy whispered. Before Silas could answer, a voice emerged from the shadows beside the building. "He's where he always is these days, counting Blackthorn's money." They turned to see a woman step into the lamplight. She was young, perhaps 20, with auburn hair pinned back severely and eyes that held too much knowledge for her years. Her dress was simple but clean, and she carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to hardship. "Who are you?" Silas asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "Name's Sarah Mitchell. I work at the telegraph office." She studied Billy with obvious concern. "And unless I'm mistaken, this is the Carter boy everyone's been looking for." Billy pressed closer to Silas. "Are you one of them?" Sarah's expression softened. "Child, if I was one of them, you'd already be dead. I've been trying to find you for 3 days." She turned to Silas. "You're Holt, aren't you? The one they're all so afraid of? Depends who's asking. Someone who's tired of watching this town rot from the inside out." Sarah glanced around nervously. "We can't talk here. Too many ears. Follow me." She led them through a maze of back alleys to a small boarding house behind the general store. The building was run down but clean, and Sarah moved through it with the confidence of someone who knew every creaking board. "Mrs. Henderson's place," she explained, lighting a kerosene lamp. "She's visiting her sister in Topeka. We'll be safe here for a while." In the lamplight, Silas got his first good look at the woman. There was something familiar about her features, something that nagged at the edge of his memory. "You said you work at the telegraph office," he said. "That means you see all the messages coming in and out of town." Sarah nodded grimly, "including the ones between Sheriff Marks and Jedediah Blackthorne. They've been planning this for months, Mr. Holt. Your ranch isn't just about the land. It's about what's buried underneath it." "What do you mean?" "The railroad's coming through, but not where everyone thinks. The official route goes 20 miles north of here, but Blackthorne's got inside information. The real route, the profitable one, goes right through your property." Silas felt the pieces clicking into place. "That's why he needs the deed. Without it, he can't prove clear title to the railroad company." "Exactly. And there's more." Sarah pulled a folded telegram from her pocket. "This came in yesterday, addressed to Garrett." Silas read the message, his face darkening with each word. "They're moving the girl tomorrow night, taking her to Kansas City." Billy's face went white. "Kansas City? But that's hundreds of miles away." "It's worse than that, son," Silas said quietly. "Kansas City's where girls like your sister disappear forever." Sarah placed a gentle hand on Billy's shoulder. "That's why we have to move fast. But there's something else you need to know, Mr. Holt. Something about why Blackthorne wants you gone so badly." She moved to the window, peering through the curtains before continuing. 10 years ago, during the courthouse fire, a lot of records were destroyed, but not all of them. Some were saved, hidden away by folks who suspected the fire wasn't accidental." "What kind of records?" "Birth certificates, marriage licenses, and one very important land grant, the original deed to your ranch, signed by the territorial governor himself in 1862. Silas's breath caught. "That's impossible. My deed was destroyed in the fire. The copy was destroyed, but the original—" Sarah smiled grimly. "The original is hidden right here in Dodge City, and Blackthorne knows it." "Where?" "That's what I've been trying to figure out, but I think I know someone who might have answers." She turned to Billy. "Tell me about your father, child. What did he do before he became a homesteader?" Billy wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "He was a clerk, worked for the territorial government before Kansas became a state. Always said he kept important papers safe." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Thomas Carter hadn't just been a random homesteader, he'd been a keeper of records, a guardian of documents that powerful men wanted destroyed. "That's why they killed him," Silas said slowly. "Not for his land, but for what he knew." "And why they took Molly," Sarah added. "Insurance, to make sure the secret died with her father." A sound from outside made them all freeze. The jingle of spurs on wooden planks. Sarah quickly extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Marks approaching with 2 deputies. His face was grim, and his hand rested on his gun butt. "Back door," Sarah whispered. "Now." They slipped out into the alley just as Marks kicked in the front door. In the distance, they could hear him shouting orders to search every room. "This way," Sarah led them deeper into the maze of back streets. "I know where we can hide until morning." But as they rounded a corner, they found their path blocked by 3 men in black coats. The leader, tall and thin as a scarecrow, smiled with gold teeth that glinted in the moonlight. "Well, well," he drawled, "look what we got here. The famous Silas Holt, playing nursemaid to a runaway brat." Silas stepped protectively in front of Billy and Sarah. "Let them go, Crane. Your quarrel's with me." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, Silas." The man called Crane tilted his head like a curious bird. "See? The boy's got something we need. Something his daddy told him before we put a bullet in his brain." "I don't know nothing," Billy cried out, but his voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "Sure you do, boy. Your daddy was real chatty before he died. Told us all about the special hiding place, the one only his children knew about." Crane's smile widened. "Course, your sister's been less cooperative. Maybe you'll be more reasonable." Silas's hand moved toward his gun, but Crane was faster. The outlaw's Colt was already drawn and pointed at Billy's head. "Ah, wouldn't want the boy to have an accident, would we?" "What do you want?" Silas asked through gritted teeth. "Simple. The boy tells us where Daddy hid the papers, and we let all 3 of you walk away. Well, maybe not walk, but you'll be breathing." Billy looked up at Silas with frightened eyes. I think I know what he's talking about. Pa had a special place where he kept important things, but I promised never to tell." "Son," Silas said gently, "sometimes promises have to be broken to save lives." Billy's lower lip trembled. "It's in the old church. St. Mary's, the one that burned down 5 years ago. Pa said the basement didn't burn, and he hid a box there. Said it contained the truth about Dodge City." Crane's eyes lit up with greed. "Now that wasn't so hard, was it?" But before he could say another word, a gunshot rang out from the main street. Then another. Shouts and the sound of running feet filled the night air. In the confusion, Sarah grabbed Billy's hand. "Run!" They scattered in different directions as more gunshots erupted. Silas found himself separated from the others, ducking behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead. When the shooting stopped, an eerie silence settled over the alley. Silas cautiously raised his head and saw Crane and his men had vanished. But so had Billy and Sarah. A new voice called out from the shadows, familiar but changed. "Silas? Silas, is that you?" Sheriff Virgil Marks stepped into the moonlight, his badge glinting. But something was wrong with his face, something desperate and haunted. "Virgil?" Silas emerged from cover, his gun still drawn. "Funny how you show up right after the shooting stops." "Silas, listen to me. I know what you're thinking, but it's not what it seems." Marks holstered his weapon. "I've been trying to protect you, trying to keep you alive long enough to..." "Long enough to what? Steal my land? Sell me out to Blackthorn?" "Long enough to tell you the truth." Marks's voice cracked with emotion. "Silas, that boy, Billy Carter, he's not who you think he is." "What are you talking about?" Marks looked around nervously, then stepped closer. "His real name isn't Carter. It's Blackthorn. Billy Blackthorn. He's Jedediah's grandson." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew, everything he'd believed, suddenly shifted like sand beneath his feet. That's impossible. His mother was Jedediah's daughter, Rebecca. She ran away 15 years ago, married Thomas Carter against her father's wishes. Jedediah's been looking for them ever since. Silas's mind raced. If Billy was Blackthorn's grandson, then everything, the attack on the ranch, the kidnapping of Molly, even Billy's desperate warning, could be an elaborate trap. But as he thought about the boy's tears, his genuine terror, his protective love for his sister, Silas knew in his gut that Billy's fear was real. Whatever game was being played, the child was as much a victim as anyone. "Where are they, Virgil? Where are Billy and the woman?" Marks's face crumpled. "I don't know. But Silas, if Blackthorn finds out his grandson is still alive, if he discovers where those papers are hidden..." "What papers?" "The ones that prove Rebecca Blackthorn was murdered. The ones that prove Jedediah killed his own daughter when she tried to expose his crimes." As the implications sank in, Silas realized the game was far more deadly than he'd imagined. And somewhere in the darkness of Dodge City, a frightened boy was carrying the key to bringing down the most powerful man in Kansas, if he lived long enough to use it. Dawn was breaking over Dodge City when Silas finally found them. Billy and Sarah were huddled in the ruins of St. Mary's Church, the boy's small hands digging frantically through the charred debris of the basement, while Sarah kept watch at the broken windows above. "Billy!" Silas called softly as he descended the crumbling stone steps. "Thank God you're safe." The boy looked up, his face streaked with soot and tears. "Mr. Holt, I thought they got you for sure." He wiped his nose with a grimy sleeve. "I found it. I found Pa's hiding place." In the pale morning light filtering through the ruins, Silas could see a metal strongbox partially buried beneath fallen timbers. The lock had been broken long ago, but the contents appeared intact. A collection of documents wrapped in oiled cloth. Sarah climbed down from her lookout post. "Any sign of Garrett's men?" "Not yet, but they'll be coming." Silas knelt beside Billy and carefully lifted out the documents. "What did your father tell you about these papers, son?" Billy's voice was barely a whisper. "He said they were the truth about my mama. Said someday I'd need to know who she really was." His green eyes, so much like his mother's, Silas now realized, filled with fresh tears. "Mr. Holt, Sheriff Marks told you, didn't he? About my real name?" Silas nodded slowly. "Billy, your grandfather is a powerful man, a dangerous man. But that doesn't change who you are. But it changes everything else, doesn't it?" The boy's voice carried a wisdom far beyond his 11 years. "That's why they killed Pa. That's why they took Molly. Because of who we are." Sarah moved closer, her expression gentle but urgent. "What do the papers say?" Silas unfolded the first document, a birth certificate for Rebecca Blackthorne, born 1851. The second was a marriage license, Rebecca Blackthorne to Thomas Carter, dated 1871. But it was the third document that made Silas's blood run cold. "It's a letter," he said, his voice tight, "written by your mother to the territorial marshal, dated just days before she died." Billy leaned closer. "What does it say?" Silas read aloud, his voice growing harder with each word. "Marshal Patterson, I write this in fear for my life and the lives of my children. My father, Jedediah Blackthorne, has been systematically murdering homesteaders and burning their claims to expand his holdings. I have witnessed 3 such killings, including the murder of the Henderson family last spring. I have proof, documents showing falsified deeds and forged signatures. But my father has discovered my intentions to expose him. If something happens to me, please protect my children. They are innocent of his crimes." It's signed Rebecca Carter, née Blackthorne. The silence that followed was broken only by Billy's quiet sobbing. Sarah placed a protective arm around the boy's shoulders. "There's more," Silas continued, unfolding another paper. "A list of names, families that were killed, properties that were seized. And look at this." He held up a deed. "The original grant for my ranch, signed over to Rebecca Blackthorne as her inheritance. That's why Jedediah can't touch my land legally. It belongs to her heirs." "To Billy and Molly," Sarah breathed. "Which means," a new voice said from the basement entrance, "the boy is worth more alive than dead. At least for now." They spun around to see Jake Garrett descending the steps, his scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. Behind him came Sheriff Marks, his hands bound and his face bloody. "Sorry, Silas," Marks gasped. "They were waiting for me at the office." Garrett kicked Marks to his knees. "Touching reunion, but we've got business to discuss." He gestured with his gun toward the documents. "Hand over the papers, and I might let the boy live long enough to sign them over to his loving grandfather." "Over my dead body," Silas growled, his hand moving toward his Colt. "That can be arranged." Garrett's gun swung toward Billy. "But first, the boy dies, then the girl, then you, unless you're reasonable." Billy suddenly stepped forward, his young voice steady despite his tears. "Mr. Garrett, I'll give you what you want, but I want to see my sister first. I want to know she's safe." Garrett laughed. You're in no position to make demands, boy. Aren't I? Billy's chin lifted with surprising defiance. You need me alive to sign those papers. And you need me willing, or folks will ask questions. So here's my deal. Bring Molly here. Let me see she's unharmed, and I'll sign whatever you want. Silas stared at the boy in amazement. Beneath the tears and terror, Billy Carter, Billy Blackthorn, was showing the steel that ran in his bloodline. But unlike his grandfather, the boy's strength was tempered with compassion. Garrett considered for a long moment. You've got spine. I'll give you that. Fine. But if you're playing games... I'm not. Billy's voice was firm. Just bring my sister. Garrett whistled sharply, and 2 more men appeared at the entrance. Bring the girl, he ordered, and make sure she's presentable. While they waited, Silas caught Billy's eye and saw something there that gave him hope. A plan, perhaps, or at least the beginning of one. 20 minutes later, Molly Carter was brought into the ruins. She was 17, with the same green eyes as her brother, but her auburn hair was matted and her dress torn. Still, she held herself with dignity, and when she saw Billy, her face lit up with relief and love. Billy! Oh, Billy, I thought they'd killed you! She tried to run to him, but Garrett's men held her back. I'm okay, Molly. Are you hurt? No, they haven't hurt me. Not yet. Her eyes found Silas. You must be the man Billy told them about. The one who's been protecting him. Yes, ma'am. And I intend to keep doing so. Garrett grew impatient. Enough family reunion. Boy, sign the papers. Billy looked at the documents in Silas's hands, then at his sister, then at the ruins around them. You know what, Mr. Garrett? I've changed my mind. What? I said I've changed my mind. Billy's voice grew stronger. My mama died trying to stop my grandfather's crimes. My pa died protecting her secrets. And you think I'm just going to sign away everything they died for? Garrett's face darkened. Boy, you're making a very big mistake. No, Billy said, stepping closer to Silas. The mistake was thinking you could scare me into betraying my family. But I'm not scared anymore. And in that moment, Silas saw something remarkable happen. The frightened, trembling child who'd stumbled onto his porch was gone, replaced by a young man who understood the weight of his choices and was prepared to bear them. Kill them! Garrett snarled. Kill them all! But before anyone could draw their guns, a new voice rang out from above. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Standing at the top of the basement steps was a man Silas had never seen before. Tall, distinguished, with a silver star pinned to his vest and a rifle trained on Garrett's chest. U.S. Marshal Patterson, the man announced. And you're all under arrest. Garrett's face went white. Patterson? But you're supposed to be in Denver. Change of plans. The marshal descended the steps, his rifle never wavering. Seems I got a very interesting telegram yesterday from a young lady at the telegraph office. Something about murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Sarah stepped forward with a shy smile. I sent copies of all the documents to the territorial capital 3 days ago, Marshal, along with a full report of Blackthorn's activities. But how did you... Garrett began. How did I know where to find you? Patterson smiled grimly. Let's just say Sheriff Marks here has been very cooperative. Turns out he's been gathering evidence against Blackthorn for months, waiting for the right moment to act. Marks struggled to his feet, his bonds cut by one of the marshal's deputies. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner, Silas, but we needed Blackthorn to make his move, to expose himself completely. As Garrett and his men were led away in chains, Billy ran to his sister, and they embraced with the fierce joy of siblings reunited. Sarah watched them with tears in her eyes, and Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, hope. But their celebration was short-lived. As they emerged from the church ruins, they found the street filled with armed men wearing the Blackthorn brand, and at their head, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, sat Jedediah Blackthorn himself. The old man's eyes, the same green as his grandchildren's but cold as winter ice, fixed on Billy with an expression of terrible hunger. "Hello, grandson," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "I think it's time we had a family reunion." Marshal Patterson's hand moved to his gun, but Blackthorn's men already had their weapons drawn. They were outnumbered 3-1, trapped in the open with nowhere to run. Now, Billy, Blackthorn continued, dismounting with the fluid grace of a much younger man, you can come with me willingly, or I can take you by force. But either way, you're coming home. Billy stepped protectively in front of his sister. This is my home. These are my people. Blackthorn's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. Your people? Boy, you're a Blackthorn. That blood in your veins is worth more than this entire town. You belong with your own kind. If being a Blackthorn means being like you, Billy said quietly, then I'd rather be a Carter. The old man's face darkened with rage. You ungrateful little... But before he could finish, a shot rang out from one of the buildings overlooking the street. Then another. Blackthorn's men began falling, picked off by unseen marksmen positioned throughout the town. What the hell? Blackthorn spun around, searching for the source of the gunfire. Citizens of Dodge City, Marshal Patterson called out, his voice carrying across the chaos. Folks who are tired of living in fear, tired of watching their neighbors disappear in the night. From doorways and windows, from behind wagons and water troughs, the people of Dodge City emerged with rifles and shotguns. Shopkeepers and saloon girls, cowboys and clerks, all united in their determination to end Blackthorn's reign of terror. But Jedediah Blackthorn hadn't built his empire by backing down from a fight. His eyes found Billy, and his hand moved toward his gun. If I can't have you, boy, then nobody can. The final confrontation was about to begin. Time seemed to slow as Jedediah Blackthorn's hand moved toward his gun. Silas saw the old man's intention in his cold green eyes. If he couldn't control his grandson, he would destroy him rather than let the boy expose his crimes. But Billy Carter, Billy Blackthorn, was no longer the trembling child who had stumbled onto Silas's porch. As his grandfather's gun cleared leather, the boy did something that surprised everyone. He stepped forward, not back. Grandfather, Billy said, his young voice carrying across the tense street. I know you killed my mother. Blackthorn's gun wavered for just a moment. You know nothing, boy. I know she tried to stop you from murdering innocent families. I know she gathered evidence of your crimes, and I know you poisoned her to keep her quiet. Billy's voice grew stronger with each word. But what I don't know is why. Why kill your own daughter? Because she betrayed me. Blackthorn's composure finally cracked, years of buried guilt and rage spilling out. I gave her everything, wealth, position, power, and she threw it all away for what? For dirt farmers and saddle tramps? For justice, Molly said, stepping up beside her brother. She threw it away for justice. Silas watched the scene unfold with growing amazement. The Carter children, the Blackthorn children, were doing something he'd never seen before. They were forcing their grandfather to confront the truth of what he'd become. Justice? Blackthorn laughed bitterly. There's no justice on the frontier, children. There's only strength and weakness, predator and prey. Your mother was weak. No, Billy said firmly. She was brave, braver than you ever were. The old man's face twisted with fury. Brave? She was a fool, and now you're going to be fools too, just like her, just like your father. Maybe, Billy admitted, but at least we'll be fools with clean consciences. Blackthorn raised his gun again, but this time Silas was ready. His Colt cleared leather in a smooth, practiced motion, the barrel trained on the old man's chest. That's far enough, Jedediah. Ah, the famous Silas Holt. Blackthorn's gun swung toward Silas. I wondered when you'd join the conversation. Tell me, Silas, are you prepared to die for children who aren't even yours? Silas thought of his own past, of the mistakes he'd made, the chances for redemption he'd let slip away. I'm prepared to live for them. That's the difference between us. Around the street, the standoff continued. Blackthorn's remaining men, outnumbered but still dangerous, kept their weapons trained on the townspeople. Marshal Patterson and his deputies had taken cover behind a wagon, waiting for an opening. But it was Sarah Mitchell who broke the deadlock. She stepped out from behind the general store, her hands empty, but her voice carrying clearly across the street. Mr. Blackthorn, she called out, There's something you should know about the documents your grandson found. What about them? They're not the only copies. Sarah smiled grimly. I sent duplicates to the territorial capital, to the federal marshal's office in Kansas City, and to 3 newspapers in different states. Even if you kill everyone here today, the truth is already spreading. Blackthorn's face went pale. You're lying. Am I? Check your telegraph office. I'm sure you'll find confirmation of my messages. For the first time since Silas had known him, Jedediah Blackthorn looked uncertain. His empire had been built on secrecy and fear, but both were crumbling around him. It doesn't matter, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I still have power. I still have money. I can buy my way out of this. Not this time, grandfather. Billy's voice was sad, but resolute. This time, the truth is stronger than your money. Blackthorn's gun trembled in his hand. You don't understand, boy. Without me, without the Blackthorn name, you're nothing. You'll have nothing. I'll have my sister. I'll have my friends. I'll have people who care about me for who I am, not what I own. Billy looked around at the faces surrounding him. Silas, Sarah, Marshal Patterson, even the ordinary citizens of Dodge City who had risked their lives to stand with him. That's more than you've ever had. The words hit Blackthorn like physical blows. Silas could see the old man's world collapsing around him, all his carefully constructed lies and justifications crumbling to dust. I gave you life, Blackthorn screamed. I gave your mother life. Everything you are, you owe to me. No, Molly said quietly. Everything we are, we owe to our parents, to Thomas and Rebecca Carter. They taught us that some things are more important than power, more important than money. Like what? Like love, Billy said simply. Like doing what's right even when it's hard. Like protecting people who can't protect themselves. Blackthorn stared at his grandchildren for a long moment, and Silas saw something flicker in the old man's eyes. Not remorse, exactly, but perhaps a recognition of what he had lost, what he had thrown away in his pursuit of power. You're just like her, he whispered. Just like Rebecca. Stubborn, idealistic fools. Thank you, Billy said. I can't think of a better compliment. That's when Blackthorn snapped. With a roar of rage and despair, he raised his gun toward Billy. But Silas was faster. His Colt boomed once, the bullet taking Blackthorn in the shoulder and spinning him around. The old man's gun flew from his hand, clattering across the dusty street. He fell to his knees, clutching his wounded shoulder, his face a mask of pain and defeat. It's over, Jedediah, Marshal Patterson said, emerging from cover with his deputies. Jedediah Blackthorn, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and about a dozen other charges. As the marshal's men moved to secure the remaining outlaws, Silas holstered his gun and knelt beside Blackthorn. The old man looked up at him with eyes that held no trace of the arrogance and power that had defined him for so long. You've destroyed everything, Blackthorn whispered. My empire, my legacy, everything. No, Silas said quietly. You destroyed it yourself the moment you chose power over family, the moment you chose fear over love. Blackthorn's gaze shifted to his grandchildren, who stood watching him with expressions of sadness rather than hatred. They'll never forgive me. Never. Maybe not, Silas admitted. But that's not your choice to make anymore. That's theirs. As the outlaws were led away and the crowd began to disperse, Billy and Molly approached their wounded grandfather. Silas expected them to walk past without a word, but Billy surprised him by kneeling beside the old man. Grandfather, the boy said softly, I'm sorry it had to end this way. Blackthorn looked up at him with confusion. Sorry? After everything I've done? You're still family, Molly said, joining her brother. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it doesn't change what you are to us. We'll visit you, Billy added. In prison. Maybe you can tell us about our mother. The good things, before everything went wrong. Blackthorn's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion Silas had seen from him. She was beautiful and kind, and everything I should have been but wasn't. Then maybe it's not too late, Billy said. Maybe you can still choose to be the man she wanted you to be. As the marshal's wagon carried Blackthorn away, Silas found himself standing with Billy, Molly, and Sarah in the middle of the street. The sun was fully up now, painting Dodge City in shades of gold and hope. "What happens now?" Billy asked. Silas looked down at the boy, this remarkable child who had shown more courage and wisdom than most adults ever would. "Now you get to choose. You're the rightful heirs to the Blackthorn fortune, what's left of it after the government seizes the illegally obtained properties. You could be very wealthy." Billy and Molly exchanged a look. "What do you think we should do with it?" "That's not my decision to make," Silas said. "But if you want my advice—" "We do," Molly said quickly. "Use it to help people. The families your grandfather hurt, the communities he destroyed. Turn his legacy of fear into something good." Billy nodded slowly. "Like a foundation, to help homesteaders and small farmers. And schools," Molly added. "Places where children can learn to read and write, no matter how poor their families are." Sarah smiled. "I think your mother would be proud." "What about you, Mr. Holt?" Billy asked. "Will you stay in Dodge City?" Silas looked around at the town he'd called home for so many years, then at the faces of the people who had become his family. "I think I might. Someone needs to keep an eye on you two. Make sure you don't get into any more trouble." Billy grinned, the first truly carefree expression Silas had seen from him. "I think we'd like that." As they walked toward the sheriff's office to begin the long process of sorting out the legal aftermath, Silas reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He'd started as a lonely cowboy, isolated by choice and circumstance. But sometimes, he realized, the greatest adventures begin not with a quest for treasure or glory, but with a simple decision to help someone in need. Behind them, the sun climbed higher over Dodge City, casting long shadows that would eventually fade. But the bonds forged in those dark hours, between a lonely cowboy and two brave children, between a community and its conscience, those would endure. The trembling boy who had brought a warning in the dust had become a young man ready to face the future with courage and hope. And Silas Holt, the loner who had spent years running from his past, had finally found something worth staying for. In the end, that was the greatest treasure of all. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.